When we were talking about bulk flow at capillaries, at the blood capillaries, we were saying that the net flow out was 10 because of the 35 out due to hydrostatic pressure, the 25 in due to blood colloidal osmotic pressure. So at the arterial end, it was 10 out. At the venous end, it was 8 or 9 back into the capillaries. The lymphatic system is the part that deals with that leftover 1, that little bit of interstitial fluid that didn't get returned to the blood capillaries. And the system really is made up of lymphatic vessels that transport a fluid called lymph, and lymph is basically interstitial fluid sucked into these lymphatic vessels, and the lymph is then cleaned in these structures called lymph nodes. So those are the 3 parts: the vessels, the lymph itself, and the lymph nodes that are part of the vessel network. Okay, so as I said, the interstitial fluid that leaves the capillaries, and is not returned to the capillaries, and any of the plasma proteins that are leaked out, all end up having to be returned to the bloodstream. And it's the lymphatic system's job to do that. The difference between the interstitial fluid, the fluid between cells, and lymph is just the location. There's no other real difference. Any proteins that are found in the interstitial fluid, any cellular debris, any liquid, any even cells that are loose in there, bacteria, viruses, anything like that that's found in the interstitial fluid, once it enters the lymphatic system, is called lymph. So main function, return this fluid to the blood. But it also provides the place where the immune system operates. Because of its unique properties of being able to gather all the interstitial fluid up into a confined space, it's a very good spot for the immune system to act to attack that stuff. There's other lymphoid organs and tissues that we'll discuss later that are all involved with immunity, but they're the structural basis of immunity, not necessarily the chemical basis of it. So when we look at capillary beds, when we look at the blood capillary beds, they're interwoven with these lymph capillaries, the lymphatic capillaries. And the lymphatic capillaries are really fairly unique. You'll notice that they have, each cell overlaps one another right here, and here, and they will lift up and form flaps, so that basically they become very, very permeable when the flaps are open. They act as valves, basically. There are filaments, there are proteins that are attached to the edge of these cells that are anchored out in the interstitium, that when the interstitial fluid builds up, and there's more interstitial fluid than there used to be, then it pulls on these filaments because the cells are being pushed further apart because there's more fluid between them, pulling on those filaments and then opening the valves, allowing a place for the lymph to drain into. Unlike the circulatory system, the lymphatics, while structurally are very similar to veins, it's not a circulation. It's a one-way system. There is no delivery to it. There's only taking away from the tissues and bringing it back towards the bloodstream, and actually back towards the heart. These lymphatic vessels are special capillaries with these flaps, these mini valve flaps that make them more permeable than blood capillaries. These capillaries all join together into vessels called collecting vessels. And then the collecting vessels all join together to form trunks, and eventually the trunks come together to form ducts. And then the ducts join up with veins, and this fluid is returned to the bloodstream. So the capillaries, very permeable, especially compared to blood capillaries. The openings in it, when the flaps are open, are large enough to take up debris, basically chunks. They're found virtually everywhere that capillary beds for blood are, with the exception of bones, teeth, bone marrow, and the central nervous system. And that's because the bone marrow and the bones actually have sinusoidal capillaries that function. There's no need for lymphatic capillaries because the blood capillaries are way more permeable than normal blood capillaries. The central nervous system doesn't have it because of cerebrospinal fluid. There's no need because of the cerebrospinal fluid. There are special lymph capillaries that are found in the intestines, in the walls of the intestine, called lacteals, and their job really is to take up the things that can't go into the blood. They can't be absorbed into the blood, and basically that's fat. So any digested fats, fatty acids, etc., are picked up by these lacteals because of the spaces. And we call this this special lymph that has these fats in it, we call it chyle. It actually looks a lot like milk, and that's why it's called lacteals, because the chyle really resembles milk. So I've already talked about this. The little mini flaps open and they allow more permeability. The collecting veins, or the collecting vessels, are virtually identical to veins, except they have thinner walls, and the flow through them is much slower, so there's way more valves than in veins. There's also a lot more anastomosis. There's collateral pathways that can happen. These collecting vessels in the superficial, like in the skin, just below the skin, travel back with the superficial veins. The deep vessels travel with the arteries and the deep veins. When the vessels get big enough, they actually have a tunica media that needs to be nourished, and they have blood vessels of their own, and it's vasa vasorum, the same as in the blood vessels. So as these large collecting ducts come together, they actually start to form these things called trunks. And this is the first kind of level that we name. There's two trunks coming from the lower limbs and the walls of the abdomen, and they're called the lumbar trunks. There's two of them that drain the thorax, the area around the lungs, the area around the heart, the area around the esophagus, one on either side. They're called the bronchiomediastinal. There's two that drain the upper limbs that pass underneath the clavicle. They're called the subclavian. There's two that drain the head, one on either side, and they're called the jugular trunks. There's one that drains the digestive tract, runs along the small intestine. The large intestine is where the lacteals all drain into. It's called the intestinal trunk. So we have two lumbar, two bronchiomediastinal, two subclavian, two jugulars, and one intestinal trunk. And then what happens here is that these trunks all join together and they form ducts. And there's two ducts. There's one on the right side called the right lymphatic duct, and it takes all the lymph from the right bronchiomediastinal, the right subclavian, and the right jugular, and it ends up draining into basically the subclavian vein, where the internal jugular vein and the subclavian vein meet. Basically, the beginning of the brachiocephalic vein. That's where the duct empties into. The thoracic duct is on the other side. It's on the left side, and it starts in an area called the cisterna chyli, and it takes the lymph from both lumbars, from the intestinal, from the left bronchiomediastinal, from the left subclavian, and from the left jugular. So it basically drains the entire left side of the body and the whole lower body from below the diaphragm. And it all drains into fundamentally the left brachiocephalic vein. So it looks like this. All this pink area here is drained by the left, to the left side by the thoracic duct. All the green area here ends up going into the right duct, the right lymphatic duct. We'll talk about the nodes in just a second. But all of these are collecting vessels here, and then they come together and they form the trunks. All of these areas. You can see right here where the thoracic duct ends up coming right here into the vein, and this is where the right duct comes into the veins. Either way, all of the lymph is returned to the blood. There's no heart, there's no pump involved with the lymphatic system. So what moves the lymph along is the same factors that aid in venous return. It's basically pulsations of the arteries. So when the artery pulses, it squeezes on the lymph vessel. The lymph vessel squeezing, pressure goes up, lymph moves back towards the heart because of the valves. There is some contraction of the smooth muscle walls of the lymphatic. That's not a big thing. It's also moved by the muscular pump, just walking around, exercising, that kind of thing, pushes it back. And there's a respiratory pump where deep breathing lowers the pressure in the thorax and actually draws lymph up the lymphatics back towards the thorax. We'll talk about the lymphoid cells, the lymphocytes, as they were, when we talk about the immune system. There'd be in T lymphocytes, but we'll talk about them in depth with the immune system. We're also going to see that there are macrophages, which are really which are a type of white blood cell. The dendritic cells, reticular cells, are all part of the lymphoid, but they're also part of the immune system, so we will deal with them with the immune system. Lymphatic tissue is reticular connective tissue, so really they're produced by reticular cells. It's really just a loose connective tissue. It has all kinds of spaces in it. So the space is actually gives room for the macrophages to move about, for the lymphocytes to move about, to provide a place for the immune system to work. There's two types of lymphoid tissue. There's diffuse lymphatic tissue, which is found diffusely. It's found just about everywhere. And then there are collections of lymphoid tissue that are kind of found in discrete little groups, and those are called lymphatic follicles. So we find them. We find lymphatic tissue really, and it's just reticular connective tissue. We find it anywhere where there's a potential for invasion. So it's really in the mucous membranes, in the lamina propria, places where foreign invaders can get in. The lymphatic follicles, or nodules, they don't like the word nodules anymore because people think that it's nodes. It's not. It's just lymphoid tissue, and it's found in various places in the body. Sometimes it has names like Peyer's patches. Sometimes it doesn't have names. Nevertheless, it's lymphoid tissue. These aren't lymph organs because there's only one tissue type here, and it's reticular connective tissue. The lymph organs are things that are got more than one tissue type. An organ has more than one tissue. So the simplest lymph organ is a lymph node. It's the principal lymphoid organ in the body. We find them clustered together in areas, and they're associated with the lymphatic vessels. They tend to be fairly near the surface, and they tend to be where things come together. So we have them in the groin, in the inguinal region. We have them in the axilla, the armpits. We have them in the cervical region of the body. So it's basically where your head, your arms, and your legs attach. Go back to this picture. You can see that these lymph nodes, they seem to be clustered around places where there is bending and movement. So we have some here in front of the elbow. We have a bunch in the armpit. We have down here in the inguinal region. We have this all along the intestines. We have here in the neck, in the sides of the face. So this a general distribution. There tends to be a lot around breast tissue as well. So what did the lymph nodes do for us? They filter the lymph. They basically provide a place for the macrophages to clean it out, to get rid of debris, to phagocytize any microorganisms there, any debris that's there. It's also the place where the immune system becomes activated. This is where in lymph nodes is the normal place that lymphocytes meet the foreign antigens for the first time. This is where the immune system is warned of the coming invasion, and the first line of defense, the first defenses come up here. They look like little tiny beans. They have a capsule. They have trabeculi inside. The node inside is divided into compartments. There's a cortex and there's a medulla. So in the cortex, which is around the outside, there's follicles. There's lots of B lymphocytes. There's lots of dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are phagocytes. Deep in the cortex is where the T lymphocytes are found. The T lymphocytes are mobile. They move all around the body at any given time. The B lymphocytes don't, not as much anyways. So it ends up looking like this. Anytime something is bean-shaped or kidney-shaped, the indentation here is called the hilum. Lymph nodes have a hilum. We call all the lymphatic vessels that go into the lymph node afferent vessels. We call all of the lymph vessels that leave through the hilum the efferent lymphatic vessels. And you will notice that there are more afferent than efferent vessels. This is to slow the flow of the lymph so that the lymph stays in the lymph node for long enough to actually be cleaned and dealt with. In this particular example, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 afferent and only 2 efferent. What would the highway look like if we went from 5 lanes to 2 lanes? Everything would slow down. You'll also notice that there are trabeculi, little walls here, that also kind of disturb the flow. So what has to happen is the lymph will flow in here and then around and then maybe back around here. So it just gives more surface area. It gives more before it leaves. Again, it slows everything down. The medulla is where a lot of the cells are. There are sinuses where the macrophages live, and the sinuses are found all in kind of this region here. A photomicrograph of this. Before we leave lymph nodes, the lymph enter via the afferent. It goes through sinuses, right, and then exits by the efferent. You want the lymph to flow slowly through these so that there's time to carry out various functions. And you can imagine that if you're suffering from an infection, that things are pretty active in there, and they can become inflamed, and that so people have swollen lymph nodes. A lot of the lay public think that the swollen lymph node, the lymph node that's palpable, is a lymph node, and that somehow they appear in an infection. It's not true. They become palpable when there is an infection, but the node is there all the time. The node's there even before the infection. And really the correct name for an infected, painful, swollen lymph node is a bobo. Back in the past, there was a disease that caused inflammation of the lymph nodes, caused terrible swelling, caused and ultimately caused pneumonia and death, and it caused bobos. So it's called the bubonic plague. It wiped out large parts of Europe. These people that had the bubonic plague had problems with lymphatic drainage, so they had lots of edema. Their skin would actually split, and the interstitial fluid would leak out, probably making them reek. I mean, really, bathing wasn't a very common thing in those years, so, and having a change of clothes didn't happen very often either. So these people smelled pretty bad. So what they would do is they'd fill their pockets with flowers to try and hide this stench, hide the smell. And then they'd get these big bags under their eyes because of the edema building up. So they would get bags under their eyes, and then they would start to have the edema go into the lungs and other places. So they would sneeze, and they would cough a lot, and then they would die. And nobody knew what caused it. It turns out it was a bacteria called Yersinia pestis that was transmitted by fleas that infested humans and rats. So rats were the carrier. The vector was the flea, and the pathogen is Yersinia pestis, which is where we get the word pest. But they didn't know it at the time, but they knew it must be contagious because somebody would end up in town with it, and then would wipe out the whole village. So you didn't want your kids to be anywhere near anybody that maybe had it. So you told them to be on the lookout for anybody with ring around their rosies, i.e. bags under their eyes, pocket full of posies, which is flowers in their pockets, at you, then fall down. It was just street-proofing your kids from the bubonic plague, which is bobos. It's inflamed lymph nodes. We need the same function in all the fluids that flow through the body. So lymph flows very slowly. It's in the order of 3 liters a day. Blood flows very quickly. It's on the order of 5 liters a minute. So we don't need a whole bunch of these lymphatic organs for the blood. We need it for the lymph because the lymph flows so slowly. For the blood, we use just one organ. It's called the spleen, and it's basically like one large lymph node servicing the blood. The splenic artery brings blood to the spleen. There's a splenic vein that drains it. There's a hilus. It's the same thing. This is a place where lymphocytes look at what's in the blood. So there's surveillance. This is where the response is. This is where the blood's cleaned of debris, of old cells, of old platelets, things like that. Photograph of the spleen. The spleen also works in storing the old red blood cells, iron that hasn't been transferred to the liver yet. It stores blood platelets. Before the fetus has enough bone marrow to actually produce blood, the spleen is responsible for producing blood cells, red blood cells especially. The spleen has the outer capsule and the trabeculae. There's lymphocytes, macrophages, all of that the same as the lymph nodes. However, there's a lot of red blood cells because it's dealing with blood, not lymph. I'm not so worried about that there are two areas, but the white pulp is really functioning in the immune. The red pulp is got more to do with red blood cell disposal and management. It ends up looking like this. There is a lymphoid organ that is found in the front of the chest, kind of behind your sternum. It's called the thymus. It is where T lymphocytes become immunocompetent. We'll talk about it more when we talk about the immune system. Very active in kids because they're coming into contact with novel pathogens all the time. In adults, it atrophies and basically shrinks down. So the thymus ends up looking like this, and you can see that it's reticular connective tissue. You can see the spaces in it, the net-like structure of it. So it's not involved with fighting antigens. It's not involved with filtering blood or lymph. It's involved with maturing the lymphocytes. It's kind of like a boot camp before soldiers are deployed into action. Tonsils are really lymphoid organs that deal with passage of things through the digestive system. They're more like quality control. They take samples of anything you're swallowing, food and drink, and check it for pathogens before it enters the body. It's kind of a ring around the pharynx. So there's ones on the palate called palatine tonsils. There's one at the base of the tongue, lingual tonsils. There's some in the posterior wall of the nasopharynx called the pharyngeal tonsils. When that gets enlarged, they're called adenoids. And there are tubal tonsils. These are the tonsils that are at the eustachian tubes in the openings of the auditory tubes that go down into behind your ears. All of these tonsils are basically surveillance. They're checking things that before they enter the body. There's all kinds of crypts. There are basically traps that trap particles of whatever's passing by, and it gets sampled here, so that we end up looking like like this, that there's crypts that trap particles. Earlier I mentioned things like Peyer's patches. So Peyer's patches are found all along the small intestine, and they are basically just in the mucosa of the small intestine, which is especially designed for absorption. Well, you don't want to absorb pathogens, so these are there to deal with any pathogens. It basically keeps the bad guys out. The appendix works along with the Peyer's patches, and that happens right at the beginning of the large intestine, right where the small intestine dumps out into the large intestine in what's called the cecum. So you see these Peyer's patches all along the intestinal mucosa. Everywhere that there is a mucosa, so from the nose through the digestive tract, through the respiratory tract, all of the mucosa, so the area that's open to the outside but not skin, has got some diffuse lymphatic tissue or lymphatic follicles associated with it, and collectively this is known as MALT, which is mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. It's all about protecting the body. It's first surveillance. It protects the body from foreign pathogens before they get into the body. It at least warns your body of what the coming assault is going to be. Again, we will talk more about this when we talk about the immune system.